Hey everybody, it's Jesko from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. I've got a very special episode, I guess, a special video for you today, because I'm joined by my buddy Bobby Torres from Frightbox Recording Studio and also the Frightbox Recording Academy, where he teaches how to get pro level mixes with the gear you have. And one thing, so Bobby appeared in kind of my business YouTube realm, my business world. And one thing that really stuck out when we kind of got to know each other and that I want to share with all of you guys is Bobby's experience working in a mostly untreated room, right?
Yep.
Obviously, I talk about acoustic treatment all the time, but one of the things that I do say as well is not like you don't need a fully specced out, massively treated studio to do good work. Most people will benefit from some treatment. Some people will benefit from a lot more treatment. There are people, random examples that we can probably come up with of people who work in completely untreated rooms. And you're definitely more on the untreated side, which I found really interesting. And yet your work is very spot on. And you've got a process laid out and you know what you're doing. And so I wanted to kind of put the attention on you once to see what you can tell us about the things you need to know when you can't or when you haven't treated your room fully, and what things to look out for, what tricks you use, what priorities to set both in the recording and the mixing process in order to kind of get through that without getting super frustrated because you can't hear what's going on, right? So maybe, Bobby, do you want to just start us off telling us about your room, as in like how much treatment do you have or not have in your room? What have you done to treat your room?
Well, that's a great question. The room that I'm currently mixing in, that I've been mixing in for the last 5 years, is the room I'm in right now. And there is absolutely no treatment whatsoever. Zero. You might even be able to hear it in my voice right now. I mean, it is not ideal in any way.
Sure.
Pretty much the way I ended up mixing in this room in the first place, I always used to mix out of my project studio, which is a completely separate space where I track bands.
Right.
Which
That's
even
where
that
you
room
shoot your videos as well, I guess, right?
I shoot some of my videos there. Yeah, I do all my recording there. For almost a decade at that point, I was mixing entirely there. And there isn't even much treatment in that room. I'm lucky it's an old building, so none of the walls are really parallel. And I'm just out of, just based off of blind luck, it's a relatively flat room and it's very dead. So I have a sub in that room and I was always comfortable mixing there. I just knew the environment. I was working there for 10 years.
Yeah,
Long story short, when I moved into this place, my plan was to only edit in this room, just to edit and do small tweaks, maybe mix tweaks with headphones. And what ended up happening was I bought a pair of iLoud IK Multimedia iLoud monitors, these little dinky monitors, again, just for edits. And, I would sometimes I'd start my mix here and then finish it at the studio. And eventually I just got so used to this room and I was actually happier with my mixes based on this rig that's here with the iLoud multimedia monitors. I just got used to working within this space. And I always told myself, eventually I'll treat the room. Eventually I'll treat the room. Eventually I'll maybe upgrade or move it into a different part of my house. And I never did. I'm still here and I'm happy with my mixes. So that's where I mix. And no, there's no treatment whatsoever in this room. Again, it was something I plan on doing eventually, and I just haven't gotten around to doing it yet. It's been 5 years.
And just to kind of obviously looking at the screen that we're seeing, or how we're seeing you, you are in basically the corner of one part of the room.
Yes, and there are some challenges with that, which I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, I'm pretty much there's a window here. I'm in toward the left corner of the room. So my left monitor is very close to that corner, the one corner.
Yeah. And I mean, guidelines would say that's a big no-no, but just to show that you can make it work if you want to, if you have to, if you know how to work with what you have, if you find a way to kind of deal with the issue. Exactly. Just quickly, the IK Multimedia iLoud speakers, they have some form of built-in equalization, don't they? Like they come with.
They do, but I think I keep it flat.
Okay, so you haven't even applied that to your system, as in you just use them as they came out of the box.
Yes, literally. I think there's a bass roll off. There are a few different. There's something going on in the back. I like to keep things flat. With whether it's microphones or monitors. It's just a weird, just my own kind of like ideology kind of thing. But yeah, they're just set to flat right out of the box. I don't use any room correction software. Nothing. Just the monitors. Okay. And that's it.
Okay, interesting. So maybe let's pick up right on what you mentioned just a second ago, that you said that there's an issue with one speaker being much further in the corner. So
yes.
Tell me about that. What kind of difficulties does that cause?
Well, I notice the one challenge I do have in here is bass does accumulate in that one corner. So like while I'm mixing, if I'm listening at a higher volume, I'll notice a lot of my low end sounds almost like it's panned to the corner. And the way I work around that is I just expect it at this point. And what I like to do, I like to check my low end with closed back headphones. Right. So, because as we all know, low end is one of the most challenging things to get right. It doesn't matter how great of a studio you're in. So the way I work around that,
you're still the cook in your kitchen. You're still going to be cooking that soup. Like no matter how great the kitchen is, you're still the cook. Yeah,
exactly. No, it's true. And I'm just so used to it at this point that it doesn't throw me off. I just know when I have my mix cranked a little louder, I hear a little more of a low end build up right there. So that's definitely a challenge, because when I mix at the studio, even though I rarely at my project studio, even though I rarely do these days, the low end is front and center, nice and balanced, and where it should be. But that's one challenge in this room, that something I've been planning on getting corrected, but it honestly hasn't held me back, to be honest with you. You know, I know how to work around it.
So tell me about that. How do you work around it, this particular issue?
A couple different ways. The first thing is I monitor very quietly. So when I mix at almost a whisper of a, where if someone was having a conversation with me in the room, they wouldn't even be able to pay attention to the music, very quietly. And then when I crank it up a little, when I get towards the later stages of the mix, again, I have that issue with the low end building up in the corner. I'll reference on closed back headphones. And I do a lot of referencing to other mixes I've done in the past that I knew had a solid low end balance-wise, or certain reference mixes that I've been referencing for over a decade. I have like 3 or 4 reference mixes that I literally have been referencing for, again, 10 plus years at this point. So by going back and forth between the closed back headphones, listening to other mixes that I know have proper low end, I'm able to figure it out. And then, of course, the car test. I don't know if you do the car test, but I'm a huge fan of the car test.
Well, I don't own a car, but I have the equivalent of the car test for sure. Yeah.
Yes. Funny side story here. When I did my internship, I interned at this studio called the House of Loud. They did a lot of big rock bands like Paramore, Breaking Benjamin. And I remember that when they would get a mix done, the bands would take it and go out to the car. They're in this super high-end facility, and it's the same thing. Perfectly acoustically treated, control room. They're doing the same thing, checking it in the car.
Because they know the car.
Yes, and that's the whole thing. Yeah, and I really feel, at least in my own experience, knowing the monitors and my setup, that's the most important thing. It took a while. I'm not going to say I didn't get this rig together and all of a sudden, man, my mixes were amazing. Like I said, I wasn't even trying to mix in this room. It just kind of happened by accident, where it started off with drum editing. Then it became, mix tweaks. And then eventually, I'd maybe my own projects or something. I would kind of start a project in here. And then maybe I couldn't get to the studio. And all of a sudden, just over time, over the course of 6 months to a year, I just started to know these monitors in this room. These are dinky monitors. I'm used to mixing with at that point, I was used to mixing with a sub. And I think, I don't even know, like 8-inch monitors or whatever mixed with the sub that I, at that point, had been using for a long time, 10 years. But just from sitting here and putting in the hours and listening to music on this setup, I just got to know it, and all of the imperfections of this room along with it.
Yeah. It's interesting how to some extent, like sometimes, there are certain aspects that you need to focus on, like actively, but a lot of it happens passively. Like you just have to keep going. And as you kind of grind through mix after mix after mix and constantly referencing and like figuring out, okay, this totally didn't work as I expected. But you get closer and closer to understanding, to knowing your monitors, right?
Yes,
And
I agree.
And it's maybe let's talk about that real quick, because this aspect of knowing your monitors, knowing your room is mentioned very often. But what does that even mean in practice? Yeah.
Yes.
Because I mean, obviously, it's not a person. You don't get to know it's not like they're talking back to you, but you're not in a conversation with them. But what are those? Can you give me an example of a detail that you had to learn, that you had to recognize, maybe that you remember now, where you're just like, this is what it means to learn my particular monitor?
Yes, I could tell you exactly what that means for me. At my project studio, I was using the Samson Resolve monitors since 2005, right?
Okay.
So that's all I knew were those monitors with that sub. My ears were they were kind of tuned to that setup, right? So I knew how guitars should sound. I knew where things should sit in the mid-range. I knew when something sounded a certain way, it was going to generally translate a certain way when moving it elsewhere. Now, when I was in this,
that's a feeling, right?
It's a feeling. It's a feeling.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, when I started listening to music on this setup 5 years ago, I did not like it. Like, it just sounded harsh. Because there was less low end, obviously they're small speakers. There's weird, like, because they're, and also sitting on my desk, so there's more resonance in a way.
Yeah.
So I started to learn, okay, guitars had to have this certain honk in the 1K range that I wasn't used to, really, that didn't sound right to me. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. Like, I was used to guitar sounding a little more scooped, just based off of my other system with the more low end, more lower mids. But eventually I started learning, okay, that honk is where they should be. You know, that specific kind of like honk that I would normally want to notch out while I was mixing. I started to learn, no, that's where it should be. And again, just listening to other music, a quicker way to get there is to, listen to a mix that you really like. And all of a sudden, oh wait, the guitars sound honky in this mix. And then subconsciously you start to, the more you work on the system, you learn, okay, that's where they're supposed to sit. And all of a sudden it's not distracting to me. I just know intuitively that's where everything should be. You know? And the same thing goes with the top end. Things sound kind of brighter on these speakers again, because there's not as much low end. I was never used to mixing on dinky speakers like that. But now, honestly, man, for my genre of music, which is really aggressive, heavy stuff, I prefer working on smaller speakers that are more revealing in the mid-range, because it makes me focus on the mid-range and dial that in a little more accurately. And I'm not being fooled by the punch of the subwoofer. I'm not being fooled by the warmness of the lower mid, because those old Samson Resolve monitors were very colored and very pleasing sounding. And the more I got used to these, I just prefer, these are hard. These, I guess, are a little more truthful in a way. They reveal any harshness that's in the mix. So that's how I got to know them. I just got to know where that mid-range is supposed to sit on these monitors without being fooled by the low end. That's my version of it anyway.
That's great. Yeah. It just reminds me of something that I keep telling sort of friends and friends of friends who I kind of guide and coach with mixing a bit.
Yeah.
Learning how a speaker sounds means actually paying attention to what that particular monitor is doing, and not just going with what you think it needs to sound like. And that's obviously where the referencing comes in, right? Yeah. Learning your room, learning your speakers means being open to listening to the speaker and realizing, wow, that guitar is really honky.
Yeah.
But that's how it should be, because that's how my speakers and my room are coloring music in this space. And in order for it to be correct, my mixes, I need to take things all the way to that honkiness.
Yeah.
I find that's really important when looking at sibilance in vocals. Yeah? I mean, there's a range of sibilance. I mean, I could nerd out about sibilance for ages. I mean, just in terms of how you position the vocal in the mix, and all those things will affect how sibilant you will leave or not leave a vocal, right? But I find that when I show people how to use a de-esser, and I'm just like, let's listen to this reference, and I really want you to take care to pay attention to how the S's sound in this particular track while you're sitting in your sweet spot, and then try and mimic that. Don't just go listen to your mix and just slap on a de-esser and say, I think this is where it needs to be. but actually
Exactly.
have a listen first and
Yeah.
get a mental image of what that actually sounds like in a few very highly produced, well-mixed songs.
Exactly.
And then you'll figure out some of them are like more like some of them are more like shh, you know,
Yeah.
some kind of warp between the two.
Yeah.
And it's really those details that you need to learn from referencing in order to learn your speakers and your room, right?
100%, man. I've had the exact same experience. Now, it's funny when I talk to some of my students, the trick with the references though, right, is people, and I'm guilty of this, is people will then take it to the extreme and they'll try to make their mix sound exactly like that. So if I say like I love your example there, I do that a lot with cymbals, right? Because in metal, getting the cymbals right is difficult, you know, in a mix.
Yeah.
So I'll listen to a reference, one of my favorite references, even if it's one of my older mixes, I'll listen to where the cymbals are sitting. But obviously we're talking about a different microphone setup, maybe a different studio it's recorded in, different drummer, different everything. It's the broad picture of the cymbals, the level, you know. Whereas when I talk to someone that might be starting out, they'll literally try to EQ their cymbals to sound exactly like their reference. But when it comes to monitors and getting things to translate, I think it's about listening. Same thing with the de-essing, like you said, and ballparking it so it's close. Which I think, and obviously I think that trumps that. That's better than doing it blind. Because like if you tell them to stick a de-esser on the vocal, they'll get rid of all the S's completely, or maybe not use it enough. So no, I like that, man. I found the same to be true, 100%. I use very similar techniques.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the difference between what you think it needs to sound like, and what it actually sounds like. And oftentimes, especially in an untreated room, or even, to be honest, in a lot of home studios, treated home studios, there is still enough tonal distortion from your speakers that there might be a big difference between what you think it sounds like and what it actually needs to sound like. And constantly reminding yourself and getting back to that is really important.
Yes, I agree.
One kind of big picture thing that I really want to ask you as well is, though, is it still possible, even if you learn your speakers really well? I mean, your slogan is get pro level mixes, but in an untreated room, recording in an untreated room, mixing in an untreated room, is that even possible? How high can we set the bar in terms of pro level songs, pro level music, pro level sound quality, if you will? Is there a certain threshold where you say, okay, to be honest, like, this is probably as high as you, like, if you get here, you're doing well? Or like, walk me through that a bit.
I mean, this is based off of my own experience and also just following other producers. There are producers out there, especially in my genre, that don't use, they do a lot of it's taboo. You know, this is stuff that would have been taboo 25, 30 years ago, that do all their own mastering. They don't use they don't outsource their mastering. They record in like basements, like completely untreated mix. One good example of this is a guy named Joey Sturgis. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He does a lot of huge producer, like one of the biggest metal producers of my generation. He doesn't mix in a treated room. He mixes in like, I don't know now. I know the room that he was mixing even a couple of years ago was completely untreated, even when he would talk in interviews, you would hear the echo of the room. You would hear the liveliness, you know? And he's one of the most sought after producers in the genre. So I think the bar, in my opinion, can be set extremely high, you know? And I've never had anyone complain, you know? The only thing that's ever held me back as far as getting good results is just my own skill level and just the natural progression of being a producer and learning from, you know, experiences and different artists over the years. So I believe you could set that bar pretty much at the top for my genre anyway. That's my honest opinion about that.
Okay. Interesting. So that means, like, if you're out there and you're mixing an untreated room and it sounds crap, it is not the room. It is still, unfortunately, your skill level.
Yeah. Or knowing the room, you know, or knowing the room, you know, because I'll be honest with you, even to this day, sometimes I'll do remote recording where I'll do pre-production with it, or I'll track vocals in like another, someone else's house, something like last fall, I was working with a singer and we tracked all of his vocal parts in like his laundry room in the basement. And, you know, when I would reference his vocal level there, I mean, I was using just like two monitors that I never use, like these Samson cheapo monitors that I can knock around and not worry about. When I listen back to the roughs back on my room in here, it's like the vocals are crazy loud, the guitars are all over the place, but it's just because I didn't know that space. But I was still able to achieve a great vocal sound just by using some common sense, approaches, just keeping the room kind of dead. I didn't keep them in a spot where it was overly lively. But again, I didn't know that room for mixing. I would never mix in that room unless I had at least a week of listening to music there. But I agree. I think it all comes down to you can't blame the tools or the room. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's good that you mentioned that, because a lot of kind of the expectation with acoustics in particular that I see often is you treat the room and suddenly everything you do will be gold. Like suddenly everything will just automatically level up and be great. And for some people that might be the case. Yeah. But as I mentioned at the beginning there, like you're still the cook in your kitchen. Like you still need to put in the work. It is still you deciding what things need to sound like. And just because the representation is more honest, is closer to what is actually happening in the material, doesn't mean that it mixes itself.
No, definitely not.
So acoustics in many ways, that's how I say at least, is a force multiplier. It doesn't do anything for you. It can just make your job easier. Yeah. One thing that it makes easier is hearing those details, like in the sibilants that we talked about, or in your case, I forgot what you mention. What was your example? Cymbals. There you go. Yeah.
The two most challenging things for my genre, at least for me, are getting the low end right, getting the cymbals right in the mix, and also guitars are generally kind of difficult.
Great segue, because I was just going to get to that, using the details in the sound as an example. Guitar tone in heavy music is really important, and I mean, to just say it right up front, I guess the trick to getting good guitar tone is recording good guitar tone, I guess, right?
1,000,000%. Yes.
Maybe you give me the long version of that, especially in an untreated room. Yeah. Where do you need to set your focus? What are the particularities that you need to focus on to get good tone in general?
Yeah.
Maybe at the using guitar tone as an example.
Yeah, when it comes to guitar tone, by far the most important part of the chain are going to be two different things. The guitar cab or speaker that you're using, and the mic placement. For actual live guitars, that's the one. Now, if we're talking about plugins, which a lot of people use, I use them all the time, like guitar sim plugins. There's this myth out there. I can't believe it still exists, because I use both. I love both. Okay. People say that, guitar amp sim plugins don't sound as good as the real thing, and it's completely untrue. It's because people aren't using great sounding impulse responses. Because a proper impulse response is exactly what I just mentioned before: a specific speaker cabinet in a specific room with a specific mic placement. So a lot of times when people have trouble with guitar tone, it's because they're focusing on the pickups, the head that they're using, what pedals they're using, which are all important. Don't get me wrong. Those are all important parts of the chain. But I've learned the hard way from struggling for years and years and years that it really comes down to the speaker, again, the speaker cab, the speaker, and the microphone placement. Or if you're in the plugin world, the impulse response that you're using.
That represents the same thing.
Exactly. It literally represents the same thing. And if you nail those, that's where your tone, for my genre, heavy guitar tone, or even rock guitar tone, those are the crucial ingredients to a killer tone that's easy to mix. Because if you have a great tone, you shouldn't have to be struggling for hours and hours. It should pretty much be sat in your mix, a little bit of, low cut, high cut, and it should kind of fit in your mix relatively well with minimal EQ. That's what I've learned.
Yeah. And I think that's where that's a way to tell whether you got good tone, be it guitar, be it vocals, be it whatever.
Yeah.
The way to tell whether you got what you wanted is because it fits easily in the mix. You're not constantly you're not like EQing stuff, and then like halfway through the song you realize the EQ is completely off and you do it differently, and then you go back to the beginning, now it's off again, and then you put on a compressor and now it's fine, but later on it's all over the place, and like all this stuff, right? It's like you said, you put it up, you pull up the fader, you load up the track, whatever, maybe some low cut, maybe some high cut, and generally speaking, it finds its place.
Yes.
Right? That's how you can tell that you've done the job right of capturing that material.
Yes, no, I agree. And it's like that with any element in not only guitar tone. People seem to struggle most with guitar tone because it can be, there's so much, I don't want to say misinformation, but there are so many other elements of the chain to focus on, especially if you're a guitar player. Guitar players love to nerd out on all these other elements. But if you nail those, that is what really pre-mixes your guitars. And the same thing for drums, drum tuning. Even when you're recording drums, I might be weird. I love recording drums in non-studio spaces personally.
Okay.
Because I love getting creative with the ambience of the space that I'm recording in. I've recorded drums in perfectly acoustically treated spaces that are perfectly dead. There's no weird resonances, but the drums sound boring. Now, again, it depends on what you're going for. Sometimes that's good. You want a nice direct drum sound that you can meld later in the mix. I could work with that as well. But I like getting creative with the space that I'm recording the drums in. So if I'm recording in a garage that's extra splashy, I'll stick up a lot of room mics to capture that splash. And if it's overly splashy, I'll just deaden the space with, with a spare mattress or a rug, like an area rug, things like that. But still, it's about getting it right at the source, working with the source sound instead of trying to EQ it and fix it later. I've learned you could fix certain things in a mix, you could help it, but getting it right at the source is what I'm all about personally, through trial and error. That's what I've learned.
Totally. So one thing that pops up pops in my mind as you're kind of saying that is, and jumping off where we were before, so you record something and maybe you're recording a full band, all 4 or 5 instruments, standard kind of setup. Yeah. Multiple tracks, and at that point you realize you didn't record it right, you didn't get it right at the source. But then it's too late. You already captured all those instruments. Maybe there was a good performance in there as well, so you might want to keep. But how do you shift the ability to tell what you're getting is good early on into the process? So while recording, obviously, how is there any way to tell earlier on in the process is there a way to tell earlier on in the process whether the tone is right before you recorded everything and you started pulling up all the faders?
100%. I'll just give you a few examples here. Drums, right? Yeah. Let's say I'm going for a drum sound that's controlled, clear, but I still want liveliness to it, right? I'll make sure that I tune the snare to the pitch of what I want it to sound like in the mix. That's a perfect example. Snare drum. That's something that people are very particular about. Snare drum sounds, right? As am I. Like I love that. That will change the sound of your mix. If you have a low thuddy snare, you'll have a completely different vibe than if you have a higher pitch piccolo snare. And a lot of people that get into production, they don't pay attention while they're recording. They stick up a mic. Okay, let's go. Press record. And then later they're like, oh, the drummer's like, I want a more thuddy snare, or I want a higher pitch snare, and you've already recorded it, right? Now you can always go in and sample replace it, but let's just assume we don't want to do that. I'll know, okay, I'll talk to the band. We want a higher piccolo sounding snare. I'll crank up the snare, get it sounding right. I'll use proper muffling. These aren't things that cost money. This is just technique, Maybe he wants less overtones, but a higher pitched snare. I'll crank it up and I'll use some moon gels, right? So I'll get the snare sounding the way we want it to sound before I set up a single microphone. Another issue, like I said, is cymbals. Cymbals can get very harsh and crazy in a rock or metal production. And I've learned that traditional overhead placement sometimes isn't best because you can't control it later. So, for example, if I stick up a pair of overheads and my kit sounds amazing to me in those overheads, what's going to happen when the drummer's like, turn up my china? You can't. You can't. So I've learned, not only on my own, just from, interning at studios, a more modern approach that works better overall is to spot mic my cymbals in pairs. So, and you could tell even before you record, I'll have the drummer play a beat that places hats really hard because hi-hats bleed into everything. That's one of the hardest elements to control. I'll listen to each track and make sure there's enough isolation that I have enough to work with that later on I could create the blend that I want to create. Simple. It's really, when you think about it, it's common sense. Another example, bass guitar. Every rock bass player wants a crisp, clanky, hard-hitting bass tone, but they don't think to change their strings, right? So simple things. When I have a band in, I make sure we're using fresh strings. I make sure that the bass is balanced. The EQ isn't overly low endy, overly notched out, overly bright. It's kind of flat, so I can work with it later. And that's all things that I'm making sure of before I even think about touching EQ in my DAW, or I think about the mastering process or the mixing process. Always paying attention to the source. And it's when you shift your mindset over to that kind of side of the fence, you start to hear these things right there in the room. It becomes very intuitive. And that's improved my productions, because again, when it comes to mixing, it's a breeze because everything was captured properly at the beginning. And again, a lot of people, when they start out, it seems boring to do that. I'll tell you what I used to want to do. I got excited when a band would be in, but I wanted the recording over with so I could get to mixing it. That was my thing. It's like, oh, yeah, it's done. Let's mix it now.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. And I did that for years. I'd always say to myself, man, my cymbals are always harsh. Oh, my guitar tones I can never EQ them properly. My bass tones, some of them are good, some of them aren't. What am I doing? And then finally it's like, oh, well, because I just wasn't paying attention. I thought the answer was all in the mix, but a lot of it, which it is, don't get me wrong, balance is extremely important while you're mixing, as you know. But it makes your life a lot easier when things are tracked properly at the source. That's my opinion. And if you're paying attention and you have that mindset in the first place, I think it'll make, even if you're a beginner, it'll make your life a lot easier. It'll get you kind of on the fast track to producing the results that you want.
Great. Yeah. Let's move that idea back into the context of like an untreated room.
Yeah, sure.
Right. In relation to, you mentioned before that, obviously, that you like recording drums in not purpose-built studio recording rooms.
Oh yeah.
But I'm sure that, there are massive differences in what non-purpose rooms sound like, even recording studios sound like, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about like your typical band practice room, typical small studio, untreated room, I guess.
Yeah.
When we're talking about the things that you just mentioned, how does the uncontrolled room impact that? And where are there things that you might want to pay attention to in particular, because you're still working in an untreated room, and in particular maybe because the ambience of the room is actually pretty whack?
Yes, I would say this: the thing that is the thing that affects me the most when working in these untreated spaces, drums are rarely an issue. Okay. I've rarely set up microphones on a drum set and be like, this room is horrible, I can't work with this. I don't think.
Interesting.
Maybe, and I've recorded hundreds, maybe even thousands of drum sessions at this point, because if you're combining the close mics and you're miking your cymbals closer, the room, people make it seem like the room is going to completely trash your drum sound. I've never had that experience. And I've recorded in like noisy bars, stages that are, not the best as far as like being acoustically treated, feedback happening. The biggest thing for me are recording vocals. That's when you can get into trouble in an untreated space. Because
okay, walk me through that.
Yes. Okay. So the room spill will destroy your vocal sound, obviously. So what I try to do.
Tell me quickly why. How does it destroy?
Because you can't get rid of it. So like, let's say I'm recording. I love using the Shure SM7 B microphone. Unfortunately, it's actually at the studio right now. Usually I use that for when I'm doing these, but right now I'm using a Samson. But I love that microphone. And even with that microphone, it's relatively directional, and it's a great mic if you're not recording in an acoustically treated space, because it cuts down on the surrounding ambience. But even with that microphone, if I couldn't record vocals in this room right now as it stands, it's too live, it's too splashy. And when you're recording a loud vocalist, now if they're whispering like super quiet, it's not going to be as crucial. But once they start belting, it's going to bleed in, and you literally can't get rid of it. That's why it's crucial to get your room, or at least get your surrounding, wherever you're recording your vocals, as dead as possible. And the way I've done that, simple. I might even I'll experiment with where the vocal mic is in the room. So
walk me through that real quick. How do you do that? How do you check that you got what you wanted as you're trying different positions in the room?
First thing I'll do is I like to keep it nice and relaxed if I'm working with a band. I don't want to put them under a lot of pressure. I'll have the singer just do a warm-up take. I'll walk around the room and I'll kind of clap to see if there's a less reverberant section of the room sometimes. So certain bands that I've worked with, there might be one corner of the room that's extra echoey just because there's not as much, like maybe there's no furniture in that section. Maybe the area rug isn't there. So what I'll do is I'll kind of walk around and try and find a dead space just by clapping, right? Then I'll experiment with the best place for the vocalist to sing. So I'll do a guide track to the performance, and I'll see how it's affecting how the vocal mic sounds when I listen to it in solo right after he's done or she's done. If it's still too live, then I might hang up, like I might hang something around the vocal mic to cut down on the excess ambience. If I'm in a house,
you'll just do a quick recording and then just listen back 100%. And like quick leveling and see if that thing that we talked about before is actually happening, as in, does it find its place naturally, or is it like, yeah,
I do that. Yeah, I'll listen back to well, obviously, if I'm in a section of the room, I can sometimes just hear it first, so I'll know that's not going to work. You know, like if I'm like I said, just talking to you right now, I know I can never record vocals as it stands because I can physically hear it, you know?
Right.
Once I find a spot that seems relatively dead, I'll have them try that spot. And then I'll listen back in my DAW, light compression, nothing crazy. And if I hear too much spill, I know I either got to move to a different section of the room that's a little more dead, or I have to I've even used those things, those baffles that go around the microphones. Those help
what
sometimes.
Are they called? Reflection control thingies, whatever they're called.
I've used those in the past. They kind of work. They help.
Kind of work.
And it's just a game of eliminating variables or adding variables, you know. Now if I'm in a more professional space, not to go on a tangent here, but you know what's funny? My space is where my recording studio is just a rehearsal space. It's dead with foam on the walls, but I've never had the issue of room spill into the vocal mic. I've recorded out of professional studios with killer live rooms, like amazing sounding drum rooms that sound awesome on drums. And let's say I don't have access to the vocal booth. I'll try to record vocals in these, and I've seen engineers do it and pull it off. I always have to put up baffles, always have to go through all this work to get the vocals to be dead enough in these live rooms, because again, it's the same issue, the room spill into the vocal mic. So I just use the same approach in a pro studio as I would in someone's bedroom. I just use whatever I have to deaden the space as much as possible to eliminate vocal spill or room spill into the vocal mic. I get that a lot when I mix tracks that were home recorded. If I wasn't involved with the project, a lot of room spill on a lot of the tracks. And I think because people just put up the mic and just press record and that's it.
So even if you've got a kind of a home studio that is kind of mainly a mixing studio, but then you put up a microphone kind of behind you to record a singer, you still want to make an effort to kind of damp out anything reaching the microphone, even if you're in a for mixing purposes seemingly well treated room, right?
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Like vocal recordings, you want them completely dry.
Yes, unless it's an artistic thing, you know. I've gotten lucky in the past where there was one time where there's something in the building that I was in where I couldn't use my space, and I had to record out of someone else's makeshift studio, and it was completely untreated, super live. And if you go back and listen to some of those recordings, you hear it almost sounds like there's a reverb on the vocal, and it actually is kind of cool for that project, but I couldn't get at it. If the singer was like, take the reverb off the vocal, I couldn't, because it was literal spill into the vocal mic, you know? But no, I agree. Generally, 9 times out of 10, I want those vocals dead. I don't want to hear the room spill in the vocal mic. I want to be able to control that in the mix. And and for pop music, it's even more important because that's really the main focus, or hip hop or any of those genres. The vocal is front and center and needs to be, controllable in the production and mix. So that's my approach to it. Not super scientific, but for what I do,
it's getting the basics right, as always.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Also, I found that, using a dynamic microphone like the SM7B helps a lot with room spill. If you're using a large diaphragm condenser, it's way more sensitive. It's going to pick up more of the surrounding ambience. But I've heard people use closets. I haven't used that in a while, like recording in a closet. I know some people like to record vocals in a closet with a lot of, you've heard this.
Have like coats over your head, between coats, just like.
I've done that before I had my space where I'm recording at now. I've done that and it's worked, I don't know. I don't know if it's just I was a beginner and didn't notice all the issues with the vocal recording, but it sounded nice and dead and the mixes turned out okay. So again, just getting creative with your space and just using what you have. By the way, same thing with guitar amps. If I'm recording a super loud guitar amp in a really live space, I try to do something very similar where, one, I try not to record it I always tell the guitar player, set your volume to a little quieter than rehearsal level, right? That helps because you're getting less splash in the room. And I'll try and keep it in a dead spot of the room to cut down on ambience bleeding into the microphone on the guitar cab. So
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yep.
So maybe or again, big picture thinking, we've talked about the recording side a lot now. We've talked about mixing a bit, but let's bring it back to mixing, or take it back to mixing. We've captured our tracks. We've done the best that we can. Maybe we didn't do the greatest job here or there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing we can already say, if you really messed that part up, mm-hmm. it is possible that the take is unusable.
Yeah,
it is very, very possible. And I think that's one of the things that if you're working in an untreated room, mm-hmm. recording vocals in particular, mm-hmm. it's something to be aware of. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You can mess up a take to the extent that it basically becomes unusable. Yeah.
100%.
You might be lucky and creatively it fits in the direction that you're going in. Yeah. And then you can kind of lean on that. Mm-hmm. But if you are trying to take it in a different direction, it might be unusable. And that's a realistic thing to happen and something to be aware of. And I guess everybody needs to kind of make that experience once to realize when it happens.
Oh yeah. But,
let's say we've captured our material mm-hmm. in the best way we could, and it's we're pulling up our faders. We are definitely not noticing that things are totally broken. Yeah. So maybe let's talk about like the meat of mixing, balancing EQ, mm-hmm. especially once again in an untreated room, in your situation there, in your corner with the bass shifting to one side. Maybe let's talk about bass. Let's talk about mixing bass, balance kick mm-hmm. versus bass.
Yeah.
How do we figure that out? If our room's ringing, mm-hmm. if there are massive differences in the volume between different bass notes, mm-hmm. where do we even start?
That's a great question. And luckily I have a very simple answer to that. As you know, with low end, I don't think it doesn't matter what genre you're talking about. There's only so much that could fit in that low end mm-hmm. of a mix. It's very, mm-hmm. It's a lot of headroom, mm-hmm. It takes up a lot of headroom. So what I like to do when I do my rough mixes, I could do this literally without even listening. Like I could just, if I'm looking at a DAW, I know that I want my bass. This is, again, I'm a rock metal guy, and mm-hmm. it's pretty much standard of practice for rock and metal, but I want my kick sitting at the bottom, my bass guitar sitting above that, and then my rhythm guitars above that, and then vocals, snare drums, and all that stuff. Pretty much nothing below 100 hertz is going to exist in any of those tracks. The mm-hmm. subs, like everything below 100, everything's going to have its own place. So mm-hmm. before I even start my rough mix, I'll roll off everything below 40 hertz on a kick, because I know that frequency stuff, all the low, super duper low subs, it's just going to eat up headroom on my mix. It's not going to add any extra power. It's not going to help my mix. So
just
right away,
stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just going to muffle stuff. I'm going to get rid of it. Bass mm-hmm. guitar, if my kick is sitting powerfully, if it's sitting really much in the range of 40 to 50 hertz, and that's where it's really pumping, my bass can't sit there. So my bass is going to sit in the 60 to 80-ish. That's going to be its spot to shine. And then my rhythm guitars for metal, where you want a lot of that low end chugging, but you want it to be crisp and you don't want it to conflict with your bass and your kick, that's going to be sitting in the 80 to 100 hertz range as far as mm-hmm. it's where it gets to live in the low end. And by me doing that, I'm already in the ballpark. Now, obviously, my kick can be too loud and I might not be able to hear it because my room isn't ideal. But again, checking on headphones helps with that for me, and referencing. So, for example, let's say I have a mix going. This happens to me a lot, even to this day. I have a mix going. I'm like, this is sounding good. And it's feeling a little too powerful. It's sounding a little too good. I'll quickly reference a mix that I know is in the ballpark of where I want it to be sonically, and I'll notice, I could just feel it even without listening on headphones yet. I listen to the corner of my room. If there's too much action happening there, I know something's a little too loud in the low frequencies. But by doing the high passing in the way I just described to you, I know it can only be one of three things for the most part. It's either my kick, mm-hmm. my bass, or my guitars. It's definitely not going to be my vocals, because everything's gone mm-hmm. under 100 hertz. It's not going to be mm-hmm. on lead guitars, because everything's gone under 250 hertz, and so on and so mm-hmm. forth. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's what I use, and it's nothing unique to me. I know rock producers, it's very common. Sometimes I've heard of producers doing it a flip, where they keep their bass below their kick. I've never really dug those results. I want to feel the kick drum. in my mixes. I want it to punch in that low range. And so in an untreated room, just having simple guidelines like that and understanding the layering of your low frequency content in your mix, doesn't matter where you're mixing it, even if you're not even listening yet, that helps kind of set those Legos appropriately, I feel, in any production. So,
and just to kind of summarize that in a way that I hear it as well, there's the key is to have intent for all your layers.
Oh yeah.
In terms of where they sit in the spectrum, what role they play as part of the music.
Yes,
right,
100%.
And that's what's going to make it easy to judge what's going on, whether you're in an untreated room or not. Yeah. I mean, and that way you have a starting point to start from. When you start actually pulling up the faders and balancing stuff, because you have or you at least know you want to have a certain layer. Mainly occupying a certain frequency range.
Yes.
I guess that's an experience thing. It is a songwriting thing, because ultimately what we're talking about here is arrangement. Really, it's like how are your layers stacked? And a difficult song to mix, whether in a treated room or an untreated room, is one where the arrangement isn't clear, where it's not clear where each layer needs to sit. I think that's one of the things that traditional band music, where that makes your life somewhat easier, because just the way that the instruments, or the typical instruments that are picked for this sort of music, already naturally occupy roughly their right space. There are obviously a lot of flexibilities there, but for example, in the electronic music world, where you're potentially starting off by just opening up a synthesizer and picking some patch, and then you open the next one and pick some other patch, and then the next one, and things just like crash into each other. And so the intent is really important. And this is once again important whether you're mixing in an untreated room or a treated room. Because and the whether you can hear that on your speakers, it's only going to get easier and proper, and you're only going to get a good mix if there is intent there, if you know what needs to sit where, right?
Yes, 100%. I use that analogy a lot about, you were talking about like big band instruments. When I talk to, when I'm working with a band in pre-production, a lot of times I like to get these arrangement things taken care of before we even talk about the recording or anything, like the songwriting process. I tell them, think about all the amazing recordings of like orchestras that use like 2 microphones, right? What is there to mix? You have 2 microphones. There's very little, and that's because, like you were saying, the arrangement is all dealt with. All of the instruments are playing in their proper, they're designed to fit within a specific frequency range, and that's why it fits together with ease. There's no mixing. It's pre-mixed. It's band pre-mixed. It's pre-mixed. It's
pre-mixed. I mean, people like, I can't remember which music class I sat in where like just a massive light bulb went off when the teacher told us about why in an orchestra the instruments are placed where they are placed, and why there are 10 violins and like 1 upright bass, or I don't know, But
right there's an example.
That's the mixing. It's because with 10 violins, that's the volume you're going to get. With 1 upright bass, that's the volume you're going to get. There's more to it than that, but like, and then with how they're placed in terms of the what is it, the podium, the stereo field, but the kind of the podium they are standing on. That's, if you're sitting in the audience, that's how the mix comes together, by placing the people in the right spot and by the number of players with that particular instrument. And really, so there's again, there's that intent. That's how it's controlled right from the get-go. And then 100%. all you have to do is put up a stereo set of microphones, and you get the right sound almost.
That's why it's hard. That's why it's hard. Like you were saying with electronic. I'm not an electronic music guy, but I know a little bit about it. Where it's challenging because you have too many options. You could have, if you're inexperienced, you could have like 5 bass parts happening at once, and you're not going to know to high pass certain ones at certain points. And with a metal, like I do a lot of metal music. If you think about a metal band in a room, it really doesn't sound like, I don't, obviously if they're a really experienced band and they have their gear down, it still doesn't sound like an album, so we have to, as producers, really understand where things are going to fit in that mix from the get-go. And well, first by getting the arrangement right. Obviously, that's the most important thing. But yeah, I like to think of a mix as a layered cake. I use that analogy. You have things sitting in the bottom, and then a little higher in the bottom, then all the stuff in the mid-range, and then stuff at the top has to work as well. There can't be too many high-end elements that are all conflicting, and then it's just going to be messy, and you're not going to have clarity in your top end. So
exactly. And so bringing it back to the whole mixing in an untreated room idea, if your speakers and your room are giving you massive differences in levels and massive amounts of ringing, you're already making your life easier by having that intent. But now moving on from there, what are some other things that we can do to be sure what we're getting is actually what we want in terms of low end balance?
I have low end 100%. I like to use that trick of using closed back headphones. Here's the thing: especially in this room, when I'm using these smaller speakers, I could feel when the low end is kind of way out of control. That's easy. I can tell, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to that final 25%, it's hard to tell. It really is. Yeah. So referencing helps. Listening to other mixes that I know the low end is correct, that helps. Closed back headphones gives me another perspective. That definitely helps. And I feel like I could hear the low end better with closed back headphones than without. I still prefer to mix on speakers. I don't like mixing entirely within headphones. There are guys out there or producers and mixers that do that, and that's becoming more accepted in today's day.
It is. Yeah.
And again, it probably comes down to them just knowing them and working on them constantly. But the other thing that I like to do is I like to listen back on multiple sources later. So when I know it's in the final 80%, I got my mix 80% there, and it's just final adjustments, I have a stereo system that I've had since I was a little kid. I've been listening to music on this stereo since I was, 6 years old. I think my parents bought it in 1990, and now I have it. So I'll listen to my mix on there sometimes. I'll definitely listen in the car. I'll check it on my phone. And I just listen back on multiple systems and multiple environments. And by the time you're done, even though I'm mixing in a less than ideal room, by the time you reference it on all of these different playback systems, you pretty much get there, especially if you're working with 4 or 5 different playback systems. If it's working on all of them and they're all drastically different, I don't see what else is left. That's just me,
And I think all of them show you a different perspective onto the same material. Right.
Yes.
And so you will, on one side, as you learn your room, you will also learn all these other systems, and you will know where their strengths are at showing you weaknesses.
Yes.
And what you probably shouldn't pay so much attention to because they're really bad at showing you that aspect of the music. Yeah. Correct?
100%. Yeah. Like obviously a phone is not going to show you what does a phone even represent? Everything below like 300, 400 is gone. There's nothing,
Except maybe a modern iPhone, which now reaches down to 20 hertz apparently. So they say.
Does it really? Wow. That's pretty incredible.
No, of course not.
But perfect example. Let's say I really want to make sure my kick drum and bass drum, my kick drum and bass guitar is going to translate across the board on all different playback systems. If you're listening only on a subwoofer, only on an amazing hi-fi playback system, it can sound great. You could feel the low end. You hear all the notes of the bass, but what's going to happen when a kid, where most people are going to listen to music anyway, is listening on their phone, and your bass and kick drum are gone. They've disappeared. That's why referencing on these multiple systems, you could tell it's going to translate. And like you said, a phone, its strength is going to be, I guess, the mid-range, right? It's pretty much all mid-range, and I guess there's top end in there as well. For me, it sounds like all mid-range. That's just how it sounds to me. But it's great to reference there because that's going to really reveal your mid-range. So these are the tricks that I like to use. Even if I was mixing in a perfectly acoustically treated environment, I would still probably be doing the same things.
That's the thing, right? I mean, people come to me and they say, or one of the reasons people want to treat their rooms and they come to me is because they want to they want to stop doing so much referencing.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And usually I usually don't comment because the truth is you'll probably continue doing that amount of referencing. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It might be easier. It become easier. You might be able to go further in your room before you take it out to all these referencing systems. You might be in like 80-90% of the cases get it to where it needs to be, and then you reference all those systems and you don't have any great and like huge notes, any huge changes that you want to make. Exactly. That's where the advantage lies in actually then getting that high quality of a studio system or your main system to work on, is that you get to the result quicker. But you'll never stop referencing. You might reduce the amount of references that you do, and you might be quicker going through that process, but it never really stops. Please.
Oh, no, I was going to say, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I sometimes come across because I talk about this a little bit in my videos with my studio, and it's not treated and all this, and people start to think that I'm anti-treatment,
Right.
No, and that's not true. I just never got around to it. I just, like, it's one of those things. I even talked to you, and we talked a while ago. I'm going to be building out a new studio in my basement, and I might do I'm probably going to do some treatment. I'm going to, why not? I think I'm ready for it, anything to shorten the process. It's just that, in my opinion, you don't need these things, like I'm making it work as it is. There are producers out there like Joey Sturgis, as an example, that an amazing platinum producer that still to this day doesn't use any treatment. It all comes down to what you have at your disposal. And understanding the way this stuff actually works in practice, in my opinion, because like you said, people think if you have your room treated, your mixes are going to be amazing. Just like if you buy this Neve preamp, your vocals are going to be amazing, and it doesn't work like that. It really doesn't. So that's my 2 cents. That's want to throw that in there.
Totally, I completely agree, and it's down. Getting good results is down to, in my opinion, to the robustness of your workflow to uncover what needs to change or what you need to work on. Yeah?
Love that.
And I'm not sure what maybe you can give us a quick example of what your typical steps in terms of when does which reference system come in, over how many days, ideally, if at all, do you spread a mix of one song? If you want to walk us real quick to kind of the different steps, like from start to deciding the song is done, at what point does which of these mix tricks come into play?
That's a great question, man. And I generally follow a similar or pretty much the same structure with each mix. First, I start off blind. I do the high passing thing that I just mentioned to you. I know I don't want anything below 60 hertz on my bass. I know I don't want anything below 40 on my kick, nothing, so on and so forth. I get a balance. I do all of my creatives, on the first day. I'll do all of my EQing, compression, usually no automation yet, because I don't want to get too detailed. I want to get the broad picture until I feel like this is sounding like a record. This is sounding, I'm happy with it as it is right now on my playback system. And if I have the luxury of having a few days to mix a song, then I'll step away after a few hours. I have it sounding great on my playback system, and I don't think about it until the next day. So the next day,
do you just real quick, do you export at that point, or do you?
Great question. Generally, I will. That's something I do a lot. I'll export, but I don't even want to hear it until the following day. The following day, I'll right away listen to it either my stereo out in my living room that I've been listening to my whole life, or I'll listen to it in my car, and that right away then I'll know, okay, the low end is way out of control, or the low end is pretty close, or the mid range. I'm going to be honest. Go ahead.
At that point, do you take physical notes or on your phone, or you just keep it in your head?
It's all in my head. Okay. Yeah, because it's always the same things over and over again. It's always the kick is too loud, the bass guitar is too lumpy, or the bass. I almost never have it the other way. It's almost never the other way. It's almost because it's very common. We want to feel that mix. We want to feel that low end, and it always sounds better on studio monitors than in the real world. You always have to pull it back, at least for me. So the following day, and sometimes I get lucky and I nail it on the first shot,
So does that mean when you're listening on your hi-fi or in your car that first time, does your attention automatically look at the low end and the lumpiness you said in the bass? Is that like the first thing you pay attention to?
I just know.
Are you already watching out for it and like thinking, is it going to peak my threshold, my too much threshold, or? Yeah.
Yes. Pretty much, yeah. That's what I'm listening for. And to be honest with you, when you listen to a playback system that you've been listening to for so long, and you know what music sounds like, intuitively, because you're listening to professional albums that aren't even. When you're listening to music passively as a listener, you're not always thinking about the kick drum. Always thinking, you're just listening, and it's kind of in your mind. You have a mental picture of what music sounds like on this particular playback system.
There's an imprint, an emotional imprint that gets captured. 100%. Right?
It's instinctual. It's emotional. So when I press play on that mix the following day, and all of a sudden I hear that like stuff I don't like. Okay, well now I know. Then I go back up. Then I tweak everything I think I need to tweak, I might reference. I want to mention this. Sometimes on that first day, when I get toward the end of the day, of the few hours that I'm working on the track, I'll start to reference one of my other mixes, or I'll reference some of my reference mixes before I even plan on listening to it out in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
The next day, that's when I feel, okay, that bass is about 20% too out of control. Bass guitar, kick drum, a little too loud. Then that's when I start to, let's listen to the reference, or maybe it's even a reference from another song on the album that the band approved that I'm working on. Then I'll check with closed back headphones. That's when I start to say, and then when that starts to sound close, then I know I'm pretty much close to being done. Then finally, I'll maybe check it on the phone for a mid-range test. That's one of the later stages. Mm-hmm. And I have some mixed tricks for that just through experience. I know that my bass guitar, I'm going to have to saturate the mids to make them cut through for my genre, because bass guitar could sound powerful on a low hi-fi system, but the second you listen on a phone, you don't hear any notes. You just hear clank, or you just hear nothing, you know? But the phone is one of the last stages. And then that second trip to the car, that second trip to the living room, I pretty much have it in the there. Then it's fine. Then it's the final automation moves, the creative, like, you know, ducking the guitars behind the leads, or maybe the background vocals, taking the lead vocal down a few dB so there's room for the background vocals. And it's all just fine tuning, and then the mix is done. So that's my archaic process. I mean, I know it's pretty common, but
it's perfect. It's perfect.
Yeah, that's
it's
how
great.
I do it.
I mean, I think it's probably very similar to a lot of people's, because that's kind of how you end up, right? You realize where those reference systems have their strengths, their strengths.
Yes.
God, pronunciation. And you realize at what point during the process you want their feedback for for you to understand what you need, right?
Yep.
And so you focus on certain fundamentals at the beginning. Like, I mean, low end is obviously crucial to carry the groove, the rhythm of the music, a lot of the vibe.
Oh, yeah.
If the low end's right, usually the rest of the stuff will usually fall in place relatively easily, or other way around. If the low end is wrong, nothing's going to work. So you kind of, often most people, I guess, me included, will figure the low end out first.
Yeah.
At least kind of 80-90%.
Yeah.
And then start focusing on the rest of the spectrum, rest of the music. So you know at what stage in this process of mixing a record you want to pull in a certain, or ask a certain reference system for their opinion, right?
That's awesome, man. I love that. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, that's what we're all doing. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a matter of figuring that out. Yeah. And then again, it's a matter of a robustness in that process. I don't know how many times I've forgotten to ask a certain reference system for their opinion, and then just get a slap in the face afterwards.
You know?
Yeah. And then it's just like, I should have listened to it in my car. You know?
Yeah. Yep. Definitely.
And so I think that's one of the, for me at least, one of the main takeaways from what I'm hearing from you and what I've learned as well. No matter how much you treat your room, you're still the chef. You need to develop your taste by learning how to listen. You need to develop a procedure that is robust so that it uncovers all the stuff that might go wrong and makes sure all the fundamental things that make a good mix, make a good record, are at least consciously covered once in that process.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And at that, once you've done that, you can also happily say, I'm done.
That's it.
Usually.
If it sounds good, it is good. That's what
usually, right? Yeah. I mean, you might then listen to it and you say like, and you can do tiny tweaks forever.
Yes.
But at that point, you're really done. Correct. Yeah. And that's, I mean, people ask like, when is the mix done? Well, once you've gone through that process, and at some point it's also just a decision, and you say, you know what, screw it. I don't care that one D like S.
You're not going to notice it. Yeah, the way I look at it, all these little details that drive you nuts at the end, like that one little S or that one, I don't know, tom hit, is just a little too low-endy. That one, when you listen to the album in 6 months, you're not even going to notice it. You know, you're going to say, wow, this mix is killer, or whatever, or the opposite. But that's true.
Yeah. Dude, I think this is great. We've covered a lot of stuff. Maybe I think it's probably a good point to jump off there. Like I mentioned, we've covered a lot of stuff, going from the recording side of it to the mixing side of it. And I mean, obviously realizing that a lot of it is getting the fundamentals right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
none of this, as everybody says, there are no magic tricks. It's focusing on those fundamentals and getting them right.
Yes.
In that sense, you've prepared something for my audience, I believe.
Yes. For
Can you
anyone
just really tell me about that?
Sure. Yeah. Again, I'm mainly a rock and metal guy. And when it comes to that genre, there's so much hoopla out on the internet about what plugins you're using, what monitors you're using, what microphone, all these different things. And people really want a pro sounding mix. And unfortunately, people end up spending all this money on tools that can help, but are not going to make or break your mix. It comes out, like you said, it's the fundamentals that matter. So I have a guide. It's called 5 Steps to a Better Heavy Mix.
Excellent.
And it showcases and highlights the 5 things that I feel you should really focus on if you want to improve the sound of your mixes and make them sound truly professional. And it has nothing to do with gear. It all has to do with the robustness, like you said, of your workflow and your system when you sit down to mix. And it's all laid out in a simple PDF. And that's what it is. It's the 5.
I'll put that in the link and in the description, at the link in the description, so people can download that.
Yeah.
And just quickly, where else can people find you? I mean, you've got your YouTube channel.
Yes.
That is just Frightbox Recording.
Yep, just Frightbox Recording on YouTube.
Period. Exactly.
You'll find me. Tons of videos on metal and hard rock production, recording, mixing, the whole 9 yards. And then my website, if you want to look at more resources for production training, it's frightboxrecordingacademy.com.
Okay, great. Bobby, thanks for joining me on this little venture into the craziness of mixing in an untreated room.
Yeah. Well, dude, it's been a blast, man.
Only to figure out that really it's the same as mixing in any other room. If
exactly.
you focus on the right things, right? But yeah, thanks for joining me on that. I hope a lot of people got, especially if you're just starting out, especially if you are working in an untreated room, really got something from that. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks for having me, man. It's been a blast.
See you soon.
Yeah,
buddy.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.